Welcome, everybody. Today we are going to discuss the causes of World War II. Many people believe, especially Americans, believe that World War II started on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, but this is not, in fact, what caused the war. At this point, depending on your perspective, World War II had already been going for either 2 years if you believe it started in 1939, or 4 years if you believe it started in 1937. And the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was the spark that brought the United States into the war, but it was not what caused the war to begin with. Today we're going to look at the 7 main causes of World War II. First one is the Treaty of Versailles. Second is American isolation. Third is the Great Depression. Fourth is rise of totalitarian dictatorships. Fifth is appeasement. Sixth is expansionism. And seventh is nationalism. So Pearl Harbor did not cause World War II. First cause is the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was the treaty that ended World War I, officially ended World War I, and part of the big points of the Treaty of Versailles was that it forced Germany to accept blame for the war, even though they were not the actual cause of World War I. There were a lot of other causes of World War I. Germany was forced to accept blame for the war. As a result of them accepting blame for the war, Germany lost a large amount of territory. You can see here on the maps, 1914, Germany is fairly large. They lose a large chunk of space to Czechoslovakia, and they lose a chunk of territory to Poland, both of which were not nations before the start of World War I. At the end of the war, having accepted responsibility for World War I, Germany was also forced to pay large reparations, or a large amount of reparations, to the Allies. And this caused them to print money excessively, and they ended up, their currency was hyperinflated because they ended up printing so much money to help pay for the reparations they owed to the Allies. And lastly, the Treaty of Versailles severely limited Germany's ability to defend itself. Germany was limited to 100,000 soldiers, whereas France, Belgium, Poland, all the nations around it had much larger armies, and this put Germany in a poor situation if there were to be another large-scale conflict. At the time, the U.S. was also moving towards being an isolationist nation. After the failure of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, the Kellogg-Briand Treaty, where they outlawed war, the United States started to take a step back from being an international presence, and this only escalated after the stock market crashed in 1929, and the U.S. then passed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff in 1930, which essentially ended international trade. It started an international trade war, and world trade severely decreased, as you can see, as in direct result to the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. And lastly, America was moving towards isolation because America as a nation was trying to get out of the Depression. It was in a major depression throughout the 1930s, and it was focusing on improving conditions at home. The Great Depression itself not only affected the United States, but it also affected other countries around the world. Germany had massive inflation in the 1920s, right before the Great Depression, and then industrial output of Germany, or German production of goods, dropped dramatically after the stock market crashed in 1929. With the Depression hitting, unemployment was high around the world, and as unemployment grows and people felt that there was no hope for the future, that's when you start getting dictators like Hitler coming into power. And as time progressed, he gained more and more power in the Weimar Republic, which was the German state, the name of the German government at the time. Third cause is totalitarianism, or the rise of it. So what is totalitarianism? Totalitarianism is the glorification of the state. Your nation is the best nation. There's one leader, and the main thing that makes a totalitarian government, or that helps me remember totalitarianism, is that a totalitarian government controls all aspects of society. They control what you do, they control what you can purchase, they control where you can go. Every aspect of society is controlled by a totalitarian government. They also use high amounts of propaganda to glorify their own nation and to put down other nations, and to put down this group of people that or any group of people that they view as causing their troubles, and those are what scapegoats are. Totalitarian governments also restrict movements, and they, throughout history, have formed youth organizations to help indoctrinate new members at a young age. So the nations that were totalitarian governments during World War II, you got, first one, communism springs up in Russia. Russia becomes the Soviet Union in the late 1920s, or late 1910s. Shortly after World War I, Russia becomes the Soviet Union when communism takes over in Russia. Benito Mussolini rises to power in Italy with the Fascist Party in the 1920s, and then the National Socialist Party takes over in Germany in the early 1930s. And on the other side of the world, in East Asia, in the Far East, you have militarism rising in Japan. Japan has an emperor throughout World War II, but the military really starts to take over in Japan, and you really start to get a militaristic leadership. So even though the military is the one fighting the wars to expand the nation, they're also the ones dictating policy in the nation. Nationalism. So nationalism, fourth cause, I believe we're on 4, is the belief that your nation is superior to every other nation, and this can lead to major conflicts between nations because you believe your nation is better, so you believe that your nation should get everything that the other nations have. So appeasement. Appeasement comes into play with Britain and France and Germany. After World War I, the area that is currently black is what is Germany. So Germany has their main land, and then this area over here is also part of Germany. It's called East Prussia. Britain and France engaged in this policy of appeasement, so they were giving into Hitler's demands, hoping that it would prevent a future war. And the first thing that he did was he rearmed the Rhineland. The Rhineland is this area in red squiggly lines that separated Germany and France and Germany and Belgium. And it was demilitarized after World War I so that France could feel secure on its western border. In 1938, then Germany takes Austria. They march into Austria. There's very little, if any, military bloodshed, and they take over Austria very peacefully from a military standpoint. Then Germany demanded this area in Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland, and shortly after they demanded the area in Sudetenland, they take the rest of Czechoslovakia. So now all of this is Germany by the end of 1938. And early 1939, Germany agrees to a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and invades Poland, which is when World War II officially starts in Europe. On the other side of the globe, though, World War II started a little bit earlier. So Japan, after World War I, Japan has its main islands, but it also has territory in what is now Korea. In 1931, Japan stages an incident where a bridge explodes, and they use that incident to invade Manchuria, which is this area in orange. They needed Manchuria because Japan, as it is, does not have much land, many resources, and so they needed more area, they needed more space and resources. They used Manchuria to get a lot of the natural goods or a lot of the raw materials that they would use to build ships to fight the war later on. And then in 1937, the full-scale fighting breaks out between Japan and China in what's called the Sino-Japanese War. This happens in 1937, and this is when World War II officially starts in the Pacific, because the Sino-Japanese War starts in 1937 and does not end until 1945, when World War II ends as well. The next year, there are border wars between the Soviet Union and Japan, and then in 1940, Japan invades French Indochina, which is this area down here, what is modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And all of this, to put in perspective, this blue area is a U.S. colony at the time. The Philippines during World War II were a colony of the United States, or at least at the beginning of World War II, were a colony of the United States. So getting back to American isolation, when Germany officially invades Poland, or when Germany invades Poland in 1939, the U.S. passes the Neutrality Act of 1939, which is cash and carry. The U.S. agrees that as long as the British and French, or the Allies, will pay for the goods and carry them themselves, the U.S. will start selling goods to European countries, whereas before this, the U.S. was not selling any goods to nations at war. In 1940, the U.S. passes this, or the U.S. and Britain make this deal: destroyers for bases. The U.S. gave destroyers to the British, and the British gave the U.S. access to 8 naval bases in the Caribbean. Early in 1941, the U.S. passes the Lend-Lease Act, where we'll give goods to the Allies, and they will pay us back eventually. So U.S. gives goods to Britain, France, the Soviet Union, not really France, early 1941, but they give goods to Britain, Soviet Union, and any allied nations to help fight the Axis, and the nations that we give these goods to will pay us back eventually. FDR used an expression: if your neighbor's house is on fire, you're not going to charge him to let him use your water hose to help put it out. You're going to give him the water hose, let him put it out, and if the hose breaks while he's putting out the fire, he'll pay you back eventually. And then later in that year, later in 1941, the U.S. places an embargo on Japan. As we saw from that last map, the Philippines are right in between where Japan was expanding and Japan's homeland. And the U.S. embargo on Japan was for oil and scrap metal, which Japan needed in order to continue producing weapons for war and to produce its ships to help it succeed, to help its navy sail around and fight the wars that they were in. This embargo directly is responsible for the attack on Pearl Harbor, because Japan knew that with the U.S. embargo, Japan would not be able to keep fighting a war for an extended amount of time, and so they decided to try and take out the U.S. Pacific Fleet before the U.S. got into the war, because they knew they wouldn't be able to respond in the end. And those are the main causes of World War II.